everyone. I'm Randall Miller, a member of the Social Sciences Committee of HASP. Welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time in our classroom, and also welcome to everyone joining us virtually. For those of you who are in the room, this is a good time to remind you to take out your cell phones and make sure they're on mute. We have had that issue in the past. Next, this is a reminder that you continue to enjoy our fall 22 courses by registering for the second half of the term starting tomorrow, Tuesday, October 18th at 9 a.m. The registration period will open for those classes that begin after November 1st. And they include courses like Bias in the Media, a personal favorite of mine, Technological Revolutions and the Arts, Secrets of Our Solar System, and Electric Vehicle Charging in the United States, just to name a few. There are many, many more. So please read your HASP happenings email message from yesterday for more details. And now to today's class, the Quad Alliance, Japan, Australia, and India's efforts to contain China. We're delighted to have with us today Dr. Fred Johnson. He's an associate professor of history at Hope College. Prior to his higher education career, he served in the United States Marine Corps as a communications electronics officer and as an infantry officer in the Marine Reserves. A graduate of Bowie State University, he earned his master's and PhD at Kent State University. His primary field of study is 20th century U.S. history, especially the Civil War. His other areas of expertise are United States military history and African history. Please welcome Dr. Fred Johnson.
Thank you. Good morning, scholars of HASP. Good morning. You all know how this works. Thank you for the good introduction, Randall. Like you pointed out, we're going to be looking at the Quad Alliance. But I want to start off with a warning first. As I was growing up getting interested in history, one of the things that I used to listen to back in the days when they still had LPs, there was a recording by Walter Cronkite. He narrated the crises of the 20th century. And the one thing that I always remembered that stood out to me, as you know, Walter Cronkite was identified as being at one point the most trusted man in America. In fact, it was Walter Cronkite, his singular editorial report, when he went to Vietnam in the wake of the Tet Offensive, Walter Cronkite, who never gave his opinion, but simply reported the news. Oh, don't you miss the days? Walter Cronkite came back and essentially said in his Cronkitean way that the Vietnam War was essentially lost. He didn't say it was a disaster. He just simply said it couldn't be won. In military language, that means that's a loss. And that the best way for us to handle that was to get out with as much honor as we could. Not a whole lot of honor in 1968. But there was still something to be found. But what Walter Cronkite also did on that record, I remember this because I listened to this record over and over and over and over again to the point where my mother said, boy, please don't play that record again. And it was this. He said, during the 1930s, Europe hungered for peace, but fascism, gorging itself on the weaknesses of faltering democracies, pushed onward towards war. And then, of course, he would go on to give the narration about how the Nazis attacked Poland in 1939 and the failure of the Americans to join the League of Nations after World War I, and all these various elements and disparate things all added up to a crisis from 1939 to 1945. So I want to start off talking about the Quad Alliance with that warning, because as we shall soon discover, whatever's going on with the Quad Alliance, which involves 4 countries, it's much larger than that. The challenge primarily is coming from China. China has for a long time been a major power, and it has now achieved the status of superpower. It was one of the big 5 after World War II. They joined the Security Council on a permanent basis. The Quad Alliance, primarily as indicated by this map, consists of India, Japan, the United States, and Australia. Now, one of the things that people don't talk about when it comes to a map like this is people talk about the Pacific Ocean, but there's also a region that's called Australasia, Australia, and the Micronesian nations that are close to it. I've included this map because it seems to me foolish and short-sighted to talk about anything having to do with India and not include the region of the Indian Ocean. In the Indian Ocean, I know that we do have an island over there called Diego Garcia, which has been identified and used for a number of years as a forward pre-positioning base for American military personnel, much to the angst and quite acute irritation of the people who are on the island of Diego Garcia. Also, you'll notice that at Somalia is to put it simply, a basket case, although Somalia has in Mogadishu one of the most natural deep water ports for naval operations in the world. Further south, in Kenya, you have Mombasa, which is also a port that's been used quite a bit by the US Navy and other Western ships, other naval powers. A tremendously large problem in the region is piracy, primarily Somali pirates. But you'll also notice further to the north, you see Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, India. In other words, that region called the Middle East. That region called the Middle East has in it Egypt and Sudan. Egypt and Sudan, although physically located on the African continent, they culturally, politically, and historically identify more with Saudi Arabia and Iraq and that region called the Middle East. In considering the Quad Alliance, history matters. And by that, I mean this. Look at this map of the communist world in 1950. We can understand why the leaders and people back then would have been a little bit upset, a little bit nervous about how communism was spreading across the world, particularly in Asia and across Europe. Another viewpoint from the top of the world, from the Arctic perspective, you see there the Asia outpost, Japan. To give us an idea of just how fast things changed, we need to remember that it took only 5 years for Japan to go from being an arch enemy of the United States to being an essential ally with the start of the Korean War. The post-war world ended up having changes in a really, really rapid sense. And of course, China was part of that concern. The legacy of American relations in China, the legacy of Western relations in China is, to put it in a word, grim. For a number of years, China was fought over as one of those vast colonial prizes that were desired by the English, the Japanese, the Austrians, the Americans, and the Russians. This gives you an idea. If you need any other indication about how weak China was, how divided it was, how much it could not defend itself, think of this: the fact that any nation, was threatened by the Austro-Hungarians, an empire that was inherently weak because of its ethnic minority problems, and an empire which really wasn't an empire, but a nation that had commanded Central Europe only because it was allied with Germany. The one thing the Austro-Hungarians wanted to do for the entire time that Franz Joseph was on the throne of Austria-Hungary was to crush Serbian Croatian nationalism and autonomous movements to try and get independence. They were a mishmash of all kinds of different peoples and languages and cultures and histories and religions that were constantly frothing and fuming. So even they got in on a big chop-up sale, the big chop-up maneuver that was being committed against China. The United States was one of those nations that also participated in the colonization of China, or at least benefiting from the colonization of China. This is John Hay. John Hay started out in life, in an earlier career, he was one of two secretaries that Abraham Lincoln, two personal secretaries for President Abraham Lincoln. After the president's assassination, he went on to have a very storied career as an international diplomat and a politician in America, of his own right. He backed something called the open door policy. Now, this open door policy, very curious. It essentially established a precedent or established a policy that said, listen, why don't all of us, the Western powers, the colonizing powers, simply agree that China belongs to no one power? That we all have access to the country, to all of its wealth and riches, and that if you don't press me about my claim, I won't press you. In other words, let's all exploit it equally together. That also happened in Africa, by the way. In 1884, 1885, Otto von Bismarck, the chancellor of the newly united Germany, Germany was united, the Northern and Southern Confederations in 1861. And by 1884, what was going on in the African continent, specifically 1879, what was going on was not the beginning of, but simply the recognition of a process that since 1850 had been happening on the continent, where Europeans have been reaching out and grabbing vast swaths of territory, excuse me, on the African continent and laying claim to it. Now, the problem with this were multiple and multidimensional. The obvious ones being, of course, there's a problem for the African people of various countries and people groups, but also because as Europeans were laying claim to this piece of territory, and as Spain claimed this, and Germany claimed that, and Britain claimed this, and France claimed that, oftentimes their claims overlap each other. Those overlapping claims caused disputes on the continent that transferred or were translated back into diplomatic irritations back on the continent of Europe, beginning a slow process of European irritations on the continent that became one of many sectors or avenues of conflict that began to build toward a thing called World War I. Ever heard of it? Now, to speak bluntly, during this period, the idea of Europeans fighting over each other in Europe over territory in Africa was seen as what? What for? Africans? Africans? It's unseemly. Why would you do that? The land is there to be taken and to be used for the Industrial Revolution 2.0. John Casson, the American representative at the Berlin Conference, was there to make sure America was included for one thing only. America did not want a big footprint on the African continent. They had Liberia, didn't really want that. What they wanted to make sure of was that American trade access, particularly to the Congo, was made available. If Americans want to participate, they just wanted guarantees that they wouldn't be excluded. Likewise, in China, America wanted to make sure that they had access to the country, didn't necessarily want to have a legation there or any kind of responsibility for a colonial possession, just trade policy. With China comes the legacy of, well, also one of the nations involved in Chinese colonization, Japan, particularly Imperial Japan. When I say Imperial Japan, I'm talking about Japan as of the Japan during World War II, the one led by the military government led by Hideki Tojo. This picture from 1937, where the Japanese bombed Shanghai. This picture was given the name Shanghai Baby. This child somehow survived the bombing of a Chinese railway station when people were trying to flee. Think of reports you've heard or seen recently about kamikaze drone attacks against civilian targets in Ukraine. Transfer the several hundred miles further south, and you have China, 1937, a different time period. Unprovoked war, indiscriminate attacks upon civilians, knowing crimes against humanity, and the world standing around wringing its hands trying to figure out what can we do. So the Japanese, when it comes to their relationship with the Chinese, they have a long, long history of blood on their hands up to their shoulders. The thing I want to really emphasize about this is people in Asia and Europe have a uniquely different relationship with the subject of history than Americans do. For them in Europe, World War II is still recent news. In Asia, it's still recent news. In other words, there are buildings that I've seen standing in Munich that have been left standing that were bombed out during the bombings of World War II, and the Germans have left them standing because they want those as living, standing symbols as a reminder of what happened during that conflict. Auschwitz is still around. Dachau is still around. They want the physical evidence there so that people in Germany don't forget. Likewise in Asia. So they're concerned with this issue of Chinese expansion. The people in Asia is from a different perspective, similar to, but different from the Americans. For us, particularly, I sincerely wonder sometimes if our leaders, the ones who are making policy on this stuff, whatever administration it may be, wherever they come from the political spectrum, left, right, far left, if they have the basic knowledge of this to make informed decisions on how to handle this stuff. If you look at some of the other features of then and now, in 1949, the Soviet Union exploded their first atomic device, and we were worried about nuclear weapons and a global conflagration. In 2022, the Russians have threatened the use of nuclear weapons, and we're worried again about what? A global conflagration. Can I share something with you? That if you begin talking about the use of tactical nuclear weapons, there's a word. What was it? Oh yeah, escalation. In my previous life, as a communications officer at Camp Lejeune, I was with the unit called 5th Battalion, 10th Marines. They were a self-propelled artillery unit. One of my jobs, one of my responsibilities was to inventory on a monthly basis something called the Naval Warfare Publications Library. In that library, at the time, all on microfiche, I used to spend hours in that library where the guard would lock me in, double lock the doors, and lock a door behind that door. I would spend hours in there reading that information because I could not believe that somebody had actually taken the time to write out in very specific details how to deploy tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. Because I knew then that if tactical nuclear weapons are deployed on the battlefield, that if somebody ever gave the word to just send an artillery round downrange and a mushroom cloud ended up, the person on the other end of that does not obligated to think that that's all that was going to come. They could just take the decision to send something bigger to our end, and then that's the beginning of the end for everybody. But they had taken time to write this down. There are no rules for non-escalation. It only gets worse. In 1949, NATO was established, which was a big concern for the Russians because they responded 6 years later by establishing the Warsaw Pact, what was called the East Bloc. In 2022, NATO concerns Russia still. In fact, NATO has gotten bigger and closer to Russia. It's gotten bigger and closer with the possible additions, or I think it's pretty much a done deal now that the NATO alliance has voted that Sweden and Finland, Sweden, which has been neutral forever, now is going to be part of a military alliance of collective security. Now, on the one hand, I think that NATO's expansion is a great thing. But seeing from the Russian point of view, the Russians have been worried about Western encroachment since the time of Peter the Great. And they continue to, under the czars, under the commissars, and under Putin, the Russians have always been worried about Western encroachment, and not without reason. Now, obviously, this is from June 22nd, 1941, Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. I made the point earlier that Europeans are generally more in touch with their history, more knowledgeable of it, more in touch with it, particularly its immediacy. So imagine Putin's tactic when he decided to say that his incursion into Ukraine was to denazify it. For the people in Russia who remember the bloodletting that occurred in Mother Russia from 1941 to 1945, that message resonates. Because you cannot go through what the Russian people went through and forget that in a generation or two or three. I'm going to paraphrase, but I think that the statement I've heard sometimes is that the World War II was won by American money, British will, and Russian blood. Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia, was a disaster because from his own perspective, Adolf Hitler referred to Slavs, that would be Russians, as Untermensch. And then, of course, if you were Juden Untermensch, if you were a Jewish Slav, you deserve to be killed twice. So swift, ultimately disastrous, but Russia came this close, very close. And it wasn't until Joseph Stalin said that the war against the Nazis was not so much one of ideology, but said defend Mother Russia. People may not be able to fight for communism. They may not care about communism. In fact, they hated communism. Communism had been the source of all their ills before World War II. And Mother Russia, that's something different. Mother Russia sustained them. Mother Russia was alive in folklore, literature. Mother Russia was something different. They could fight for that. How does it apply to China? Russia, like the United States, is a Pacific nation. Particularly, if you look to the lower right-hand quadrant of this map, something they're called the Kuril Islands. The Japanese and the Russians have been fighting over the Kuril Islands or disputing over the Kuril Islands for a long, long time. Please bear with me as I read from the screen. Russia's recent and rapid militarization of a group of islands claimed by Japan has flown largely under the radar. Taken by Russia at the end of World War II, and by the way, they were disputing this during World War I and before, Kunashiri, Etorofu, Shikotan, and the Habamai Islands, I practiced that all night, of the Kuril Island chain. Japan claims the islands as its northern territories, and it's complicated relations between the two states for decades. Around the year 2012, it seemed that some of the islands might be returned to Japan. The now deceased Prime Minister Shinzo Abe sought to foster goodwill and get Russia to return the closest islands through things like diplomatic exchanges, trade relations, and so on. But the Russians in recent years have increased its permanent military presence on the Kurils since 2015. Media reports and satellite imagery show Russian barracks, airstrips, and other infrastructure have been constructed over the last several years as close as 14 miles from Hokkaido. Russia's steps to boost its presence suggest that the islands will continue to play a pernicious role in the future of Russo-Japanese relations. And if in fact, that's going to affect Russo-Japanese relations, that means it's going to affect Russo-American relations, particularly complicated by the expansion of China into the Pacific region. And that Japan and the United States should deepen consultations regarding Russia's activities in the region. So from both the east, the Russians already feel like NATO's encroaching on them from the east, from west to east, but also now an increased U.S. concern in the Pacific region, particularly closer ties with Japan, and they're already very close. It's anybody's guess as to how a Russia that's always worried about encroachment from the west might feel about an encroachment from the east as well. And China and Russia have been allies before, not just World War II. In this picture, soon after World War II, during the 1950s, there was something called the Sino-Soviet Alliance, where Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin were, for about maybe 5 or 6 years, there was a honeymoon between the Soviets and the Chinese communists, but they broke down because Mao refused to be dictated to by Stalin and wanted to have his own brand of communism. So the alliance broke apart. But today, while the alliance may not be close, there is definitely concern about these two leaders, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who are not working explicitly together, seem to see things eye to eye on a global scale. Vladimir Putin. I think sometimes I tell my students that in order to understand this guy, you gotta look at his background, or anybody's background, actually. Vladimir Putin started off in life as a KGB officer. He remembers when the Soviet Union was a power. He remembers when the Soviet invasion of Ukraine would not have given the results that it has right now. The Soviet Union was a superpower for a good reason. It was a superpower, not a fake superpower, but a real superpower, and not just because it had nuclear weapons, although that's a pretty big qualifier. It had a very capable weapon, very capable military, and he remembers that he was part of his state security apparatus. And Russia at the time, the Soviet Union, contained all the different republics, as you see there, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Moldova, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan was where they had the Baikonur launch facility, where the Russians took the lead in the space race, what they call the stands. And of course, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. I think people forget that Joseph Stalin himself was a Georgian, so he's from one of the minority republics who became the leader of the Soviet Union. a very much integrated society as much as it could be. And so now you have Putin, who is a descendant of that system, remembering when Russia was a world power, a bigger world power, a more potent world power, and they still have something called the Russian Federal Security Service. And it's very likely that he will be boss for life. Sure looks that way. And then there's Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is from a country that, again, because they remember their history, because it's more, it's closer to them, and the legacy of colonialism. And look, if it had just been the colonialism, that would have been bad enough. But while I have not been in China, I have been in Vietnam several times. I've been on the African continent a number of times. And I have asked this question very explicitly. And the people who, quite frankly, I just tell y'all straight up, sometimes being a person of color gives you an entree that you wouldn't otherwise have. They will share things with you that they wouldn't otherwise tell you. So I asked them, on the basis of we know that the colonization was exploitative when it came to taking out your natural resources and your minerals and grabbing up land and ports and all the rest of that. But what about the other part? I never had to feel out what that means. They go like, yeah, there was that too. The racism in China. And also in Vietnam. And also in Africa. Yeah. So when you add that part, that leaves a large footprint and a long memory train that I can't say for sure, but I'd be willing to bet that it's all part of what's also motivating China's rise and expansion right now. Now we know that when it comes to the issue, that there's no one person can claim victimhood all the time or villainhood all the time, because the Japanese clearly showed that they could be just as racist in the Pacific during World War II as any other conquering nation. In fact, they were pretty horrible. But Xi Jinping, coming from with a history of China having a history such as it does, and being the latest inheritor of the nation established by Mao Zedong. Mao, for a while, had been allied with Chiang Kai-shek. And they both had some common enemies, not just the Japanese, when the war started in 1931. That's another thing too, when it comes to understanding American-Chinese relations and American and Chinese perceptions of Japan. America doesn't get involved in World War II until 1941. Japan went marauding into China in 1931 with the invasion of Manchuria. By 1937, they were committing atrocities in Shanghai. So for a whole decade, Japan was doing all kind of just heinous acts in China well before the Americans got involved in World War I, and only then in response to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But before all that, Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong have been battling for the mainland of China. This was a very uneasy alliance to be sure. Some of the things that Chiang and Mao could agree upon when they were fighting against the Japanese, and then eventually setting aside their weapons to cooperate to get rid of World War II, to get out of World War II. They both agreed that one, China needed to resist imperialism and reestablish true sovereignty over Chinese territory. They agreed that China needed to be ruled by a single authoritarian party. Both Chiang's Kuomintang, or it's also called Kuomintang, and Mao's Chinese Communist Party were organized along explicitly Leninist lines, which means it was going to be authoritarian, dictatorial. They weren't even trying to be democratic or look like democracy. They both agreed that China needed to unify and take control of all Chinese territory from the militarists or warlords. This is part of what had China so fractured and so at odds with itself. The warlords who controlled much of China from 1916 to 1928, and I suggest to you that when you're controlled by warlords in a fractious environment for 12 years or more, that can seem like an eternity. Actually, one source said that it was longer than 1928, more like into the 1930s. They both agreed that China needed to repudiate the imperial dynastic system and prevent the introduction of its essential features, which included hereditary monarchy, the civil service examination, and state Confucianism. In other words, all those things that have been included in the Chinese governmental, social, political structure that are guaranteed to keep the many impoverished and the few not just wealthy and privileged, but super wealthy and super privileged. Most of all, and I think this is a big thing that drives China today and Xi Jinping's aspirations. China, they agreed that China needed above all else to attain wealth and power so that a self-governing and dignified Chinese nation might one day stand among equals in the world. There's a reason why Iran wants to attain a nuclear weapon, not just because they want to threaten the United States and other actors in the region, but a nuclear weapon will give you viability. It gives you respectability. In the same way that in an earlier period, let me use another example. In an earlier period, early 20th century, when Kaiser Wilhelm came to power in Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, one of the first things he did after firing Otto von Bismarck was to set Germany on a vast naval building program. Why? Because in the early 20th century, having a big navy meant you had arrived on stage. It meant that you could project force abroad, to use the language of the Navy Department. It meant that you could flex your muscles. In other words, people had to take you seriously internationally. They couldn't blow you off anymore. There's a reason why Theodore Roosevelt in 1907 sent the Great White Fleet of the United States around the world. So let the world know that America was not only a power, but had arrived on the world stage and you had to deal with us. In our time, obtaining nuclear weapons will do the same thing with much more lethal consequences, obviously. It's a matter of national pride, a statement of power, and for the Chinese, with a history of being called the weak men of Asia, and those kind of pejorative statements and comments, being able to be taken seriously and the desire to be taken seriously has to be a driving factor. Now, in 1949, after World War II had ended, obviously, 1945, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek went back to fighting each other. And in 1949, Chiang was kicked off the mainland onto Taiwan. And there, the Kuomintang government is today. Now, that island was called Formosa after being discovered by some Portuguese explorers, or let me rephrase that, when the Portuguese explorers found out too. Mao Zedong went on to be the chairman of the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party. He was there, he became the boss for life. And right now, as we speak, as I'm speaking to you, Xi Jinping has opened up the fifth party, the most current party Congress, and is highly suspected, in fact, it is suspected that he will get another presidential term, which will make him the most powerful Chinese leader in modern times, certainly since the end of World War II, essentially making him the boss for life, just like Mao Zedong, just like Vladimir Putin. So there you go. Now, two behemoths like that being run by bosses for life and such a history behind them, it invited in 2011 during the Obama administration a pivot, as they call it, from the Middle East to Asia. And as I mentioned to you all earlier, it wasn't just from the Middle East to Asia, but from the Middle East to also Australasia. Australasia is interesting because it includes the Philippine archipelago, the Micronesian states, Indonesia, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, American Samoa, French Polynesia, a lot of places that at first pass, maybe you wouldn't consider them to be very important. However, during World War II, these islands became extremely critical for America's prosecution of the war against Japan, particularly in walking the war back to the Japanese home islands. So who knows what's going to happen in the future? But my guess is that with China's expansion into the area, no, we can say this specifically with certainty. Because of China's expansion into the area, these islands have already increased their strategic values regionally. The one thing to keep in mind about the Philippine Islands is that whereas I personally have lamented losing Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base and Olongapo, we gave those back certainly more than well over 10 years ago. But One of the issues that happens with the Philippines right now and America's relationship with it is the Filipinos have recently, in addition to having had Rodrigo Duterte as their president, who's already been accused of all kinds of human rights violations and was essentially a dictator, they have elected a relative of the former President Marcos, whose own relationship with democracy was strained, to say the least. In 2015, President Obama took a trip through this area of Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, and the Philippines. Let me read. On April 19th, Japan began its first Western expansion of its military presence in 40 years, building a radar station on Yonaguni Island in Okinawa Prefecture. I don't think people in the United States realize how profoundly important this was. The Japanese essentially had their constitution, the one they've been living up under since 1945, written by Douglas MacArthur. Now, Douglas MacArthur there are people that love Douglas MacArthur, there are people that hate him. You know, it's either one or the other about that guy. But for all of his parts of flaws, limitations, Douglas MacArthur at the end of World War II was insightful enough to understand that if you remove the emperor, which many people wanted to do, that if you remove the emperor Hirohito, you would cause a civil war, which is always worse than a standard conflict. So he used his influence to keep Hirohito in place and thereby keeping Japanese society cohesive, giving the people, keeping their symbol alive, which allowed the occupation of Japan. And then he, not single-handedly, but did have a tremendous impact on the writing of the Japanese Constitution that they still live up under today, which declared that Japan would be a Pacific nation, not because of the region, but as in pacifist nation. After their militarist history, the last thing they wanted to do was to repeat that history. So a Japanese military expansion, after all that, after what happened in World War II, after 2 atomic bombs, this is significant. It's a significant change in Japanese policy and a significant recognition of American necessity to have a more beefed up ally in the region. Second, South Korea, still living right next door to one of the world's most bizarre nations on earth, backed up by still the Chinese government and supported by the Russians. It has been said that the Chinese government uses North Korea as a foil or as a means to keep America honest in the region, to keep us off balance in that entire region. Malaysia, Indonesia, what you're dealing with in Malaysia, Indonesia, although it wouldn't come up too often. In Malaysia, Indonesia, you have certainly Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim country. And then in the Philippines, I mentioned also about Rodrigo Duterte, the new Marcos in charge right now. Please let me read again. Malaysia, along with Vietnam, the Philippines, Brunei, and Taiwan, claims portions of the potentially energy-rich South China Sea. China claims virtually the entire area through a so-called 9-dash line, which the Philippines recently challenged at a United Nations tribunal. Now, we thought for a moment that energy had become a thing of the past, energy concerns. We thought that we had all those kind of things licked. People feel different ways about fracking. But honestly, I don't know about you all, but I was absolutely stunned to read a newspaper one day, said America become the world's largest exporter of oil. Really? Because I said, well, how come my gas is at 29 cents a gallon? We have it to give away, but there it is. So energy clearly is still a concern for many Americans. And I don't know how that market works, but it's just very confusing. This is from the Council on Foreign Relations, which gives you an idea of the amount of money that's being spent in different countries in the area. But U.S. assistance to Europe and the Middle East dwarfed aid to Southeast Asia in that same period. Even in Southeast Asian nations where U.S. security assistance has increased under this rebalance. This is what the Obama administration called their pivot to Asia, the Great Rebalancing. So even with that, under the rebalance, the amounts of aid are relatively small when compared to U.S. security assistance in the Middle East and Europe. Translation, Middle East is not going anywhere. Its challenges remain. In fact, they may even be exacerbated by what's going on in Ukraine right now. OPEC obviously remains a power or an issue to deal with for foreign policy. Also, when it comes to dealing with changes going on in this region, we have to look at issues like what's going on with the Chinese minority called the Uyghurs. There are all kinds of violations happening right now, allegations of people being herded into concentration camps or re-education camps, which is the more euphemistic term, I guess, the Chinese leaders like to use. But according to Vox.com, Xinjiang, where about 11 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities live, is an autonomous region in China's northwest that borders Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia. It has been under control since 1949 when the People's Republic of China was established. Now, the last time that we talked about issues of great decisions, when we met the last time talking about refugee people moving across the globe, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and other former stands of the Soviet Union are now under pressure because with Putin mobilizing or calling for a second mobilization of troops for the war in Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing to these areas. They're not being allowed into Western Europe. Poland has closed its borders to many of them. So they're fleeing to the former parts of Central Asia, which is going to cause further complications in those regions as well. So this whole thing about what's going on with the Quad Alliance, Japan, Korea, Australia, and India, all this is regional, but it's also interconnected to every other thing happening on the planet. The point is this, or one point is this: the United States of America is a superpower. And it has super consequences and super influence, not just soft power, but hard power. We understand that different things happen when you deploy an aircraft carrier battle group to any part of the world. But what I'm getting at is this: American power and American presence means something in a world where you can have a sneeze over here that causes a cough over there. And so with that kind of influence still, even with all the changes we've been going through, we are certainly right to look at specific regions for specific moments, but this is a global concern that American foreign policy makers, I hope, will contend with. So obviously, when it comes to that, what's happening with the Uyghurs and this expansion of China into the Quad Alliance area, there may come a moment, in fact, that moment has come several times, when Americans have to deal with human rights policies. They just simply may have to hold their noses and not do anything about it. Let me give you a more contemporaneous example. Many people still have questions about how is it that in the early 1990s, the situation in the Serbo-Croatian wars was bad enough to make the Clinton administration finally move into doing something there to support the NATO alliances, when Slobodan Milosevic was committing all kinds of atrocities and war crimes against Muslims in that area and establishing concentrations in Europe again. And yet, 2 years later, when catastrophe broke out in Rwanda, where nearly 1 million people were killed in 90 days, nothing happened over there. How did one disaster rate more catastrophic than the other one? Certainly killing nearly 1 million people in 90 days, if nothing more than the spectacular nature of it, it requires some type of attention. The answer may be what happened in 1993 or what happened earlier with regard to Black Hawk Down, when the Americans intervened in Somalia against the war of Muhammad Farah Aidid. And if you've read the book Black Hawk Down, or if you've seen the movie Black Hawk Down, you know that turned into a disaster. So on the one hand, American policymakers were too afraid to go back into Africa because, look, the long storied history of that continent in this country, in addition to the transatlantic slave trade and many other things, was that even as early as 1973, President Richard Nixon, in a conversation with Henry Kissinger and his then Secretary of State, William Rogers. Now, imagine this. You got William Rogers standing here. He's the point guy for American foreign policy. He's the one that President says, here's my policy. He goes and implements it. That's his job. He's the face of American foreign policy. In this White House meeting, Kissinger and Nixon are talking, and here's Rogers standing there like a potted plant. And Nixon says to Kissinger, Henry, let's you and I take the rest of the world. No, let Bill take care of the N-words in Africa. You and I will take care of the rest of the world. Now, if the president is the person that sets the foreign policy tone and agenda for the planet, And is that carried over into other administrations? And even if it didn't explicitly, by behavior, it sort of did, we can understand why Rwanda will be just a piece of rotten fruit on the vine that will be allowed to fall. Either way, there have been human rights violations around the world where American policymakers have had to have some real hard discussions and make some real tough decisions. In my foreign policy class, I tell the students this. Sometimes it comes down to this, and I don't like to think this way, but sometimes with the way these decisions are made and the way things are carried out, it simply comes down to, you wonder, did they simply ask the question, well, are these people important enough? I mean, look, that's the hard reality of it. Are they important enough to get involved? Some people are, some people are not. What do we, in other words, what dog do we have in that fight? So what are the fundamentals? In order for the Americans, whatever kind of relationship we're going to have with the nations of Japan, South Korea, India, which is not without its own challenges, by the way, although being the world's largest democracy, and Australia, the one thing that any international partner should expect from a partner are trust. You should be able to trust your international partners, particularly if you have an expansion from China as aggressively as it's going on right now. You should be able to rely upon your partners. In other words, they should be reliable. Trust, reliability. In other words, you have signed this treaty, this collective security agreement called NATO. If in fact Article 5 is ever violated, will you follow through and do what you say you're going to do? Because if you're not going to do that, then the whole thing is just so much paper that people blow their noses with. Trust, reliability. What our partners expect from us, what we expect from them, trust, reliability, and consistency. Can they expect us to be, are we trustworthy? Can we be relied upon? Can we be relied upon to be trustworthy and reliable, irrespective of what administration is in power or what party they belong to? Can America be relied upon to be those three basic matter who's in charge? We built a very good track record of that. In 1948, when the Russians blocked off access to West Berlin, the French, American, and British sectors, the Americans and the British got together and flew round-the-clock missions for a year called the Berlin Airlift. When I say around-the-clock missions, I mean to the point where planes were landing sometimes within mere moments and minutes of each other, bringing clothes, food, fuel, whatever the people in West Berlin needed to survive the Russian blockade. We put ourselves trustworthy, reliable, consistent in 1947 when George Marshall, the former chief of staff, and then who went on to be Secretary of State, introduced something called the Marshall or the European Recovery Act. People in Europe after World War II, understandably, were bombing and carnage had been going on for 6 years because the Nazis did not give up easily. In fact, there's something toward the end of World War II where Hitler gave an order called the Nero Order, the Nero Protocol, which was just to blow up bridges, roads, tear up infrastructure so that we can't have it, they can't have it either. Fortunately, some Nazi generals did not obey that order, particularly in the Netherlands. So with that kind of thing going on, Europe is devastated. And there is, and you've heard in our time that with the Syrians going into Europe, it's the largest refugee crisis since the end of what? World War II. World War II is the marker, it's the litmus test for how bad a thing is or is not. In that environment, where there are millions of refugees, millions of displaced people, and children are hungry, and people are starving, they're cold, and they're frightened, and they're just kind of like dazed. After 6 years of warfare, not to mention warfare against Nazis, given the way they fought the war. The European Recovery Act was both a humanitarian gesture, but also a shrewd political maneuver that said, you know, when people are hungry and starving, they get desperate. And then they may do things like, I don't know, reach out to Moscow for help. Instead of doing that, have them reach out to Washington for help. The European Recovery Act did that by interweaving those economies into a North Atlantic community called the European Economic Community that today we now know of as the European Union. The other concept being that doesn't it make more logical sense that if people are living together, traveling together, prospering together, working together, that's got to be a lot more positive than killing and slaughtering each other. So there you have the EU. We did that. We did that with the formation of NATO. In 1947, when Harry Truman announced the Truman Doctrine, where for the first time it took a real hard right in American foreign policy. American foreign policy up to that point had been, we will fight if we're attacked a la Pearl Harbor. We got attacked, we fought back. Okay, that seems logical enough. But now Truman is saying, America will have to fight democracies that are being threatened anywhere around the world. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean the world now is America's globe? What does that commit us to? Whatever it meant, we were now a global superpower because that's what World War II delivered us into. We were reliable, trustworthy, consistent. Were our policy decisions always good? No. Were there mistakes made along the way? Yes, many of them, some devastating. But we were known as an indispensable nation, and that indispensability was something that many people took comfort in, that at the end of the day, to borrow something from that Winston Churchill said, I can always rely upon the Americans. They'll try everything until they finally do the right thing. Here's a big question mark for many nations around the world, our partners in Japan, South Korea, Australia, India. Questions about American democracy. It's been strained. It's been strained before. It's under tremendous pressure. In the last few weeks since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, NATO has been given a new birth on its existence but we need to remember that just a few years before that, people were questioning whether or not NATO had outlived its usefulness. Clearly it has not. Clearly it has not. So there were millions of people who were wondering, A, had NATO outlived its usefulness? And worse yet, in my estimation, were prepared to dissolve the whole thing. Now, from the standpoint of American democracy and its fractured nature, I would not be at all offended if people in the European Union, for example, said, you know what, you guys go through these changes every 4 years, electing different presidents and so forth, and we need trustworthiness, reliability, and consistency. And you are none of those things. And you have not been none of those things for quite a while now. And we can't sit up and put our physical defense, our existential reality in your hands if we're going to rely upon you. So I'm wondering, I've been wondering if regional defense strategies, regional defense pacts will not begin to proliferate. I looked into something called CETO, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, that was established in 1953. It was supposed to be a Pacific version of NATO. Now, it finally was abandoned in 1977, but in the Cold War period, when people were worried about the domino effect in China expanding to the Pacific one more time, which was supposed to include Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and yes, India, the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization seemed like a real good idea. And it eventually had a dream of including Australia. So the more things change, the more they seem to stay the same. India and Australia, Korea, Japan, the United States, part of CETO. But again, it fell apart in 1977 because the Cold War was going in a different direction at that point. But these same four nations, Korea, Japan, Australia, India, the United States, and the same actors, a Pacific-oriented China, for obvious reasons, being a Pacific nation, and Pacific concerns that the Russians had in the Russian Far East have presented us with the same dilemmas that we had before. The big difference is not external to what's going on, because these problems are recurring on a big regular basis if you follow the ebb and flow and the pendulum of history. The only question mark, as far as I've been able to come up with anything in addressing these, is what we'll do internally. That's the only question mark that exists. And then there's NATO itself. Recently, the Italians elected as their prime minister, Giorgia Meloni, who represents a continuity of Italy's darkest episode, then toward dictatorship of Benito Mussolini. Sorry about the misspelling on Atlantic. That's what I give her revising stuff at 2 o'clock in the morning. I will speak just for myself. Given what happened under this particular leader, given the dark path of destruction that he led Italy down, why on earth would you want to replicate that? Why on earth would you even want to even flirt with the margins of this? Who invites disaster and carnage and division to the dinner table at Thanksgiving? Who welcomes it into their doorway? I mean, even vampires have to get permission to come into a house. Given what Benito Mussolini stood for, what he did to minorities, and who he allied himself with, Adolf Hitler, and who they allied themselves with, Imperial Japan, given the track record of all the millions of people's lives lost because of 3 men, think of that, 3 individuals on earth who caused over 50 million deaths. Given that history all alone, why on earth would you want to emulate that in any way, form, or fashion? And yet, a NATO member has done that. Can you see now why I think often about Walter Cronkite's words? During the 1930s, Europe hungered for peace, but fascism, gorging itself on the weaknesses of faltering democracies, pushed onward toward war. Are we a faltering democracy? Are democracies in Europe faltering? We are an indispensable nation. We are an indispensable nation. There's no getting around that. There's simply no getting around it. We are a superpower. And with that kind of superpower, with that kind of strength and power comes consequences and frankly, responsibilities. Well, let me put it to you like this. I tell the students sometimes that becoming an American citizen, people want that. It's a good thing to have. And you are entitled to all the rights, privileges of the Constitution, but also the responsibilities of being an American citizen. Participation, obeying the law, rule of law, supporting and defending the Constitution of the United States. It's not just a big grab bag of rights being protected. You are also obligated to be a participant in this democracy. So it is a bilateral relationship. It's a social contract, as philosophers would call it. So the choice we have then is, do we want to be a nation that's a strong America as an indispensable nation? And I know that phrase, indispensable nation, people don't like to talk about American triumphalism or American exceptionalism. Well, maybe it just is. Maybe it just is. Maybe there isn't a nation that can do what we do. There are others that can mimic what we do. But I remember back in the 1990s and the early 2000s, when an organization called ECOMOD, the Economic Monitoring Group of Africa, and ECOWAS, Economic Community of West African States. And at the time, I was working on a foreign policy project where the African leaders, they wanted to say, listen, we think Africans should be solving African problems. And I thought, okay, that sounds like a good idea. No more charges of neocolonialism, no more interference from the Europeans, no more interference from the Americans. You guys can handle it on your own. And yet, when it came to the crisis in Sudan, they wanted to borrow American trucks and American helicopters. Now, from my standpoint is, look, if you guys want to handle this on your own, handle it. We are one of the few nations on earth that has the airlift, land lift, and sea lift capability to move things and change the destinies of nations. I saw this happen time and time again at Camp Lejeune with convoys going from Camp Lejeune to Cherry Point or to Morehead City, where they put thousands of tons of equipment on ships to deploy to the Middle East for 6 or 9 months at a time, or to fly out of Cherry Point on C-141s to get up overseas like that. It can be done. We know that there have been some bad decisions made when it comes to foreign policy, but the United States is here. There are things at stake. We can either be this, a strong nation, and live into their indispensability, or we can choose to be this. And that's just it. The choice really is ours. I'll take your questions. Thanks.
Please let me know what questions you have and I'll hand you the mic.
I had one question. Now I'm thinking of two.
Okay.
First of all, why is South Korea not part of what they're now calling the Quad? The Quad obviously excludes South Korea. And the other question is, with all the question regarding U.S. Participation in the world, don't we still have a ton of soft power in the sense that people all over the United States, if they had a choice, or all over the world, if they had any choice where to live, would probably still want to come here? And can't we use that soft power more effectively? I know the European Union has a slightly different view on that, but but anyway, those are the two questions.
Let me say up front, I don't know the reason why South Korea is not involved in the Quad Alliance, except this. Let me hazard a guess. My guess is that the people in that alliance, India, United States, Japan, and Australia, don't want to do anything that would give the North Koreans a reason to act up any more than that they do. Okay? I mean, this guy goes off firing missiles and flying aircraft over South Korea, just because, the wind blows. So I think that American policymakers are very cagey about giving the North Korean leader, and you know what, folks, this thought just hit me. Think about this. North Korea since 1945 has had 3 leaders, only 3. So tyranny is the family business. And when you are benefiting from tyranny as much as Kim Jong-un is, you don't need to have a legitimate excuse to fire off another missile. And they've got we have established that they have an active nuclear weapons development program. So again, I think that the reason they're kind of stay away from that, so that at least that's not one more excuse to give him a reason to act up. He's been compared to a 2-year-old looking for attention, and it sure seems that way, but most 2-year-olds don't have access to full-scale militaries and nuclear development programs. And as far as soft power, yes, America has a lot of soft power, but let me put it to you like this. I had friends of mine in Kenya for the last few years who have emailed me, and then on the ground in Vietnam, friends over there who said, "What's going on with you guys?" And I said, "You live in a communist dictatorship. What do you mean what's wrong with us?" Like, yeah, but we look to you guys as a model. So that soft power is there. I don't think that we tend to appreciate just exactly how much people are looking at us around the world to set the example. I thought early on in my studies in grad school that Abraham Lincoln might have just been overreaching when he said, trying to pass the 13th Amendment, particularly in that movie Lincoln, which is the whole, we're on the world stage now. But that's true. We are on the world stage. The tradition of America, the tradition of rule for humanity, as a species, for human beings, has been tyranny, autocracy, repression. So a nation that pledges itself to have a constitutionally established democratic republic for all its imperfections is still a hope where that is still the rule for people. And so we are, it sounds so cheesy to say so, Jonathan, we're through a city on a hill, and I'm not going to pull up flags and start, blowing a kazoo or anything like that. But that means something to people who are living in concentration camps like the Uyghurs. It means something to people that are trying to do something and being hounded by Hungarian border police as they're trying to flee the Syrian civil war. That's the kind of hope that we can provide, even if people choose to never come here. So that soft power is a powerful magnet,
Other questions?
This morning, you've emphasized the importance of individuals, for better or worse. And then when you talk about American democracy, you know, historically, or at least in recent history, the Republican Party has been more hawkish than the Democratic. You might disagree with that, but in general, at least my perspective, in separating perhaps the leadership from the Republican Party if it gains control of Congress. So what concerns do you have regarding not only leadership, but political control and how that will affect what happens as we move forward?
I mean, relative to the November elections?
Or and beyond, even 2024.
Well, okay, first off, I'm not so confident that policymakers are as well informed and educated as they need to be. They have access to a lot of information, but you can walk into a library, it's still, it only matters if you open a book or do a Google search. That's the first thing. I don't think that they're as knowledgeable as they used to be, as they need to be, or used to be. And more than that, there's been a desire among leaders to pull back into a type of neo-isolationism. And of course, they can do that. But the last few times, it seems to me that when America does that, and this is, I guess I should qualify this by saying I'm a fan of the American nation. I am. And I think that the world's better off with us in it, actively, as many places as possible, than just coming back home and playing our own little sandbox. Things happen. And the other, the thing that kind of, the reason why I think that's so important, that leadership will pull us back and say, let the world take care of itself. If you say, let the world take care of itself, the world's going to do that anyway. The only variable is this: do you want the world to take care of itself without you being involved? Which is not to say America has to sit up there and pull any strings or cause any regime changes, but relative to this question about soft power, American presence there can have a modifying influence for a lot of bad actors who would otherwise do some terrible things were we not there. So there's a thing. There's a lot to be said for being able to soft power to bring a bad actor on this side of the world to the United Nations or some international body that says you're going to be held accountable. You will not get away with this. You just can't. Yes, you're a country, but you just can't go around slaughtering people in your country because you know what? There's other people around the world looking at you. So we're going to deal with you. If we had to lead that effort, then we lead that effort or support that effort. I'm not so sure. My worry is that leadership will take the more isolationist path, and then the bad actors will proliferate and multiply. And historians have debated ever since it happened whether or not we should have got into the League of Nations or not. I think most people know about the League of Nations probably say, yeah, we probably should have. Would it have stopped Japan and Nazi Germany from doing what they did? Who knows? We don't know because we didn't get involved. But a lot of people say but if we had, the possibility at least would have existed that we could have done something. Maybe. But we were in a different zone then after World War I and different time period, all the rest of that, aside from the obviousness of all that stuff. But given what's going on around the world today, with still, in addition to what's happening in West Africa with Islamic terrorism, Boko Haram in Nigeria experiencing flooding right now, refugees still coming from Syria, ISIS has gone nowhere. They've gone underground for a moment. They're still there. They're waiting to pop out like whack-a-mole. Okay, they're there. And the economic crises that are happening in Europe, not to mention the largest land war in Europe since the end of World War II, and the Quad Alliance, all these things, they need a nation that's got global capability and global presence. That would be us among others.
Other questions?
When will we think of oil as a superpower? If you look at what's happening even with India and aligning a little bit with Russia regarding, I guess, natural gas and whatever. But until we take on that superpower and try to control that by virtue of the role it's playing in controlling so many elements geopolitically around the world.
You mean oil as a nation, or you mean OPEC?
Think of it as a superpower.
Oh. Well, I think that for a number of years, a lot of people have been trying to de-emphasize the importance of oil in our lives. So that I guess the logic is simplistic, but the logic is this: if we don't rely upon it, then it can no longer be a thing that can then be used to manipulate us. It won't drive our policy. Now, it just means that you start relying upon this, and maybe it's something else. Okay, but at least you take that off the table. It can only be used as a tool or a weapon. Because it does have, just as you allude to, just as you imply, and a tremendous force and power, even with us being an oil exporter and producer. So it still causes a lot of havoc in the economy. And look, I get it. People pull up to it's a lot more fun to fill up your gas tank on $2 a gallon than it is to $5 a gallon. I understand that. And the people around the world know that too. And their policy decisions are driven, not absolutely, but with that in mind as well. There's a question over here. And then John. Okay.
We expect people around the world to respect us and to side with us or to help us out or abide with us. Yet in our own country, we have to be looked at by the other countries in the world saying, what is going on over there when our senators are saying if we indict a certain individual, the streets will be running in blood. What on earth is it they say about our court system, about the viability of our democracy when they're talking about our leaders talking about the streets running in blood?
Did any of you all watch that debate about the Senate Georgia debate between Herschel Walker and Raphael Warnock the night? Both of those men have support. Some people for, some against. To address your question, those leaders say what they say because they have support. Now, while we still have a functioning democracy, those leaders, if that support goes away, meaning out here, us, that support goes away, guess what? They won't say that anymore. Politicians are very canny, insightful animals. They will feed from whatever trough is filled with whatever they need to eat. Maybe I shouldn't have used that metaphor, but since I did run for office after all. But anyway, you know, I said this sounds so simplistic, but I think there's an element of fundamental, basic, raw truth to it. When we start being better citizens, demanding more from our leaders, and that support goes away, then they'll go away. But as long as they can find traction, let me put it to you like this. I did a presentation recently about that period where Margaret Chase Smith, senator from Maine, Joe McCarthy announced in February 1950, I have the name of 205 communists in the State Department, blah, blah, blah. And people were running scared. Now, they were already running scared because of the House Un-American Activities Committee formed in 1938. So here he is in 50, 12 years later, he's pouring gasoline on the whole notion of the Red Scare. And people are right to be afraid of communism because it was a lethal ideology. But Margaret Chase Smith, 4 months later, stood up in the Congress and gave a speech where she declared her declaration of conscience. She said, the Truman administration has been weak for not being better internationally. She said, my party has been wrong for its witch hunt of people who will otherwise be called American citizens in another time and place. Now, she was censured. No, she was sidelined. She was a woman in 1950. She had inherited, but she had taken the seat from her husband who passed away when he was in the Congress and the House of Representatives. She represented herself and won. She's the only woman in the Congress, in the Senate. That was unusual for her to do that. And because she did that, because of a very powerful man that people were supporting, she was silenced, marginalized, ridiculed, and mocked. 4 years later, when people finally had it up to here, very diminutive lawyer named Joseph Wells said, sir, at long last, have you no shame? Have you no decency? At long last, have you no decency? Now take Margaret Chase Smith over here and Joseph Welch over here, and he may as well have been talking to the American people. At long last, have we no shame? Have we no decency? He said, I will not allow you to hurt this young lad, Fred Fisher, anymore. And like that, it's like the whole nation, like they were snapped out of a trauma or a trance. Like, yeah, why are we allowing this one guy to ruin our democracy like this? And he went away swiftly. Not swiftly enough, but he did go away. Until we have the case, the courage of Margaret Chase Smith and Joseph Welch, will be where we are. Courage is in short supply.
Off subject, but you mentioned Camp Lejeune.
Yes,
We see a lot of ads about people who have gotten problems there.
what's that again?
Camp Lejeune,
Yes.
medical problems that people have had
Mhm.
being there. You want to comment on that?
Well, I was there during the time period that you're talking about. And if I pass by, I'll promise to show up in your room playing a harp. Tell all about it. I can't say anything about it, John. I've had people that I had colleagues of mine who were at Camp Lejeune, and they haven't given any kind of reports. They don't have any kind of, now I lived off base, so I don't know how fast the water, I don't know how much of the water, they say Camp Lejeune, but not Jacksonville, North Carolina. So if it was a Jacksonville area, that's different. On base at Camp Lejeune, that's a different story. I was off post. So I haven't heard anything beyond just the fact that those Marines down there were, I mean, look, if they're worried about the water people was doing, they should also investigate the food we're being eaten every day.
Question here.
Yes.
Why do you think the courage of Liz Cheney hasn't been more contagious?
You know what terrorists, okay, why hasn't the courage of Liz Cheney been more contagious? Why wasn't the courage of Margaret Chase Smith more contagious? The reason why terrorists do what they do, I think in part, not because I guess they're frustrated or they working through the system such as it is, wherever it is, isn't working for them. Fear works. Fear is powerful. And it is easier to simply go along to get along. I'm trying to think of the quote from the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. when he said something to this effect: there comes a point where remaining silent is more dangerous than being one of the people who is protesting against what you're doing. Okay, because the people who are remaining silent, by this silence, they're giving tacit approval. On the artillery range, it says, and here's what we were told on the artillery range: if you do not hear in a command explicitly telling you not to fire, they said silence is consent. So unless somebody from the firing direction center says, do not fire, or cease fire, then you are to run through with that fire mission and when we are not speaking up, when people do not speak out, you essentially you're aiding and abetting the people with silence. Okay, and it reminds me of what Martin Niemöller said. I'm going to paraphrase this too. Martin Niemöller, the German theologian, when the rise of the Nazis in just before World War II, he said, he's got that famous statement, when they came for the trade unionists, I didn't do anything because I wasn't a trade unionist. When they went for the socialists, I didn't do anything because I wasn't a socialist. When they went for the Jews, I didn't do anything because I wasn't a Jew. But then they came for me. And no one has been left to speak for me now. Not told, I spoke to a group in Grand Rapids, and I said, look, let me just be blunt with you. I don't know about all the folk in my community, but I personally have always known that if this thing goes sideways, I know they're coming for me. I know this already. The history shows that. I know they're coming for me and people like me, but now they're coming for you too. That's the big question. And while I wish you would have been concerned when they were coming just for me, history doesn't say it's going to happen. But now that the history is coming for all of us, the real question is this: shall we or shall we not do what we can to right the ship of this democracy? If in fact you think there's a 45 or 35-degree list. Now, if you think things are normal, okay. I don't see it that way, but that is the only question that is out there. Will we finally do something?
In the final moments, we're also open to questions from our remote audience, and we have someone monitoring that. So if you have questions and you're joining us remotely, please go ahead and send them in.
And there was one over here.
We have one over here?
Do we have one from the remote, from the?
Not
Okay.
yet.
I've been a Republican all my life, but I'm not sure in the situation you described this morning, this is a good time for our leader to be one that seems to have some of the borderline characteristics of an oligarch. It might be a sort of a dangerous leader to have at this point.
Who are you speaking of?
Pardon?
Who are you speaking of?
Uh,
You mean any American president?
Yeah, one of the oligarch characteristics I see is the Trump.
Okay,
person.
let me do this. I agree with you. Having an oligarch as a president is a bad idea. What I want is somebody who is, you know what? Having an oligarch as president is a bad idea because an oligarch is what? An oligarch, which means they're working for a very small sliver of the American people and not you or I ever. And they're transactional. But here's the thing that has been puzzling me. I have spent ever since the start of the semester, I have been privileged to be working with the Hope Western Prison Education Program. Every Friday, I'll go to the Muskegon Correctional Facility, and there are 24 men in this class. They're learning about the Civil War. Now, there's 2 white guys, 3 Latinos, and 19 black men. Well over 50% of the class, African-American males. And these are some of the most diligent. Man, I don't know who they were before when they did whatever it was they did to get them in that place. But as they're right now, cleaned up, sobered up in their current cells, my heart breaks every time in there because the amount of human potential that's locked up. These guys could be research scientists. They could be entrepreneurs doing all kinds of things to make us a better society, but there they are. By their own decision-making, I haven't met now one of them that's trying to get around being responsible for their behavior. They know why they're there and they're forthright about it. But 24 men, one of whom over 50% are black. And that microcosm to me represents a larger problem on a national scale where the prison population is well over 50% black, I think, or at least somewhere, some big percentage number. We are only 12% of the population. And the point I'm getting at is this. Those men are behind bars for doing whatever it was they did. But my guess is not one of them tried to overthrow the government. They're being held accountable for what they did. We had with our own eyes, somebody tried to stage a coup d'etat, and they're walking around free. Convince me there's not a system, a 2-tier system of justice. Convince me there's not something called just us. Convince me that all men are not above the law. Convince me. Because every time I'm looking into the faces of those black men, and they're learning about the history that they either didn't get, blew off, or never offered when they were in school, because they're just inhaling it. Their minds are sharp, they're quick, and their skills are just developing on an exponential basis from week to week. They're being made to pay for their crimes. And in a country where no man is above the law, I like to see that extend to the top echelons of society, even to include a president who may be an oligarch. So I agree with you. No oligarchs in the White House.
We do have a remote question now from our virtual audience.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. What other alliances might be strategic for the U.S. moving forward?
We should do a lot with beefing up our relationship with West Africa, particularly in the South Atlantic region, because I think I mentioned to you all before that Africa has become a throughway for drug trafficking from South America. The cartels have figured out how to fly supplies from the continent across the Atlantic Ocean up to Africa, and then across the Mediterranean into Europe and back across the northern part the Northern Hemisphere, to America, through Canada and North America. And sometimes the people who are making these sales and whatnot, they're buying weapons. They're not interested in drugs. They're interested in drug sales to buy weapons for terrorist operations. So those things are being used to destabilize governments, and they are causing massive destabilizations in West Africa, which are generating refugee crises in addition to climatological changes. And those refugee crises cause people to move across vast areas of land that begin to impinge upon other cultural groups and other people that could actually cause a breakdown in civil society or break out into all-out conflict. So for that reason, we need that, and we also need to reassess what's going on in Central Asia. I'm talking about with Afghanistan, Pakistan, that entire area, because the Pakistanis and the Indians, from what I can gather, still hate each other's guts. And if we could find some way of resolving the issue in Kashmir, there's so many right things going on. A few years ago, when I was finishing my master's degree over at Western, we went to Oman for our immersion trip. And in that trip, not only did I find out that there's another branch of Islam called the Ibadis, because all we hear about is just what Shiites and Sunnis, because they're the ones that sell the most newspapers and so on. But what happened with the Ibadi Muslims? I sat down with a bunch of Muslim scholars, and here we were, a bunch of Christians on this side of the table, a bunch of Muslim scholars on that side of the table. And we engaged in something called scriptural reasoning, where we read from the Quran and they read from the New Testament, comparing scripture and verse 1-to-1. And I sat there, these guys are better Muslims than I am a Christian. And we sat there and we looked word by word, we engaged in dialogue. And I said, you'll never see this on CNN. Why? Not bloody enough, not sensational enough. If it sells, it smells. If it sells, if it's what? If it bleeds, it reads. If it bleeds, it leads. If it sells, it smells. If it smells, it sells. But nobody was bleeding. Nobody was stinking, as much as I could tell.
We have time for one more question. Does anyone have one? Here we go.
Yes, ma'am.
Here you go. Here you go.
You can. It's coming. Behind you.
I send money to some politicians, especially Mark Kelly in Arizona.
Mhm.
And I probably get 40 requests for money on my iPad a day.
Once you're on their mailing list, you're done.
I know. But the thing is, they always say, well, if he doesn't win, I'm to blame because I didn't send my other $10. But anyway, how can we get rid of that? I mean, it shouldn't be a matter of money. It should be a matter of what the politician stands for.
That's true. I agree with you, just like I agree that we shouldn't have oligarchs. But everybody agrees that that money should not have the kind of influence that it does in politics. But I must tell you that when I was running for Congress, and one of the reasons why I won't run again is because I spent well over 60% of my time on the phone calling strangers asking for money. Now, look, let me just be frank with you. As a kid who grew up in a single parent household where food was an issue, I mean, like as in not having food to eat for days at a time, and money. And so my understanding, look, we didn't have all this fancy understanding of money, stocks, bonds, T-bills, and all this other kind of stuff. Money was a thing to get and hold on to. We didn't know nothing about how money could work for you. I didn't learn that stuff till I was an adult. Right, so money was, frankly, our relationship with money was very hostile. So coming from that kind of a background, to then have to be on the phone begging for money was humiliating all day, every day, and I hated it. I still hate it. Now, I'll probably be better at it now, but I'm not running for office. So there's really no way of getting around it. And I think that a devastating blow was done to us with Citizens United when it said that corporations were like individuals. Really? That you also believe in orcs and goblins and the hobbits. Okay. So I don't know, but if he loses, it's not your fault. I know that much. Thank you all very much.
Please show your appreciation. Thank you all for being here today. Thank you, Fred.